Hi, this is Rabbi Chaim Coffman. Welcome to our 92nd installment of the Torah portion of the week. We're holding on Parshas Devarim. We started a new book, the last book of the five books of Moses, the book of Deuteronomy, and it's basically Moshe Rabbeinu's swan song. It's the last 5 weeks of his life, where it recapitulates a lot of the mitzvahs, so to speak. So a lot of interesting things go on here. So here, beginning of chapter 1, it says in verse 5, it says, on the other side of the Jordan, in the land of Moab, Moshe began explaining the Torah, saying, Hashem our God spoke to us at Horeb, saying, not for you dwelling by the mountain, turn yourselves around, journey, come to the Amorite mountain, all its neighbors, and the Arava, and the mountain, and the lowland of the south, the seacoast, the land of the Canaanites, Lebanon, to the great river, the Euphrates. See, I've given you the land before you come and possess the land that Hashem swore to your forefathers, Avram, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. Give them and their children after them. That is chapter 1, verses 5 to verse 8. So Moshe says again, on the other side of the Jordan, in the land of Moab, and he explains the Torah, saying, etc. Right? So again, recapitulates a number of the mitzvahs and where they traveled, and actually gives them rebuke, and he gives them rebuke, not saying things sort of directly, but hinting things that they've done wrong, in different places, without really embarrassing them directly. But it's an interesting thing here. Comes along, Mori, Varebi, Rabbi going to Moshe Moshlita should be well. He says over here that every generation, the Jewish people have people within them that try and uproot, try and destroy, basically try and destroy them from within. Meaning that we have our own enemies, right? We have plenty of enemies. We don't have a shortage of enemies, certainly in this generation and in previous generations, right? We're talking about enemies from without, talking about non-Jews, wanting to destroy us, etc. And that's, go to recent history, see the Holocaust, see many pogroms throughout, certainly throughout history. But there's also something dangerous from within. So he says that these people from within, meaning these Jews, he says they make claims. They make all kinds of different claims. He says in the later generations, meaning in the last number of generations here, he says that they've thrown off the yoke of heaven. They made certain claims, right? And their claims don't make a whole lot of sense. They're just throwing off the yoke of heaven, and they'll claim like this. The one thing they'll claim is Jewish people are spread out throughout all the nations, so why should they be different? Right? Why should they be different? The way they dress, what their customs are, what they eat, holidays, different things. Why should they be different? Why should they be any different than anyone else? Right? That's the question. So Moses Mendelssohn, more than 100 years ago, said that it's good to be a Jew, inside your house. If you want to be a Jew inside your house, if you want to be you should look normal, on the outside. Meaning, you should dress like everybody else, do what everyone else does. But on the inside, the inside of your house, you can be a Jew. Right? Just outside, do not, look outwardly different, which is exactly what the anti-Semites say. Certainly, you go to the book of Esther. Haman made the same claim. Haman comes to Achashverosh and he says that Jewish people are different. They have different customs. They won't eat your food. They all these other things that they do that are not similar to what we do. So therefore, Haman comes up with this great idea to annihilate the Jewish people, and he gets the king's ring, and king signs off for it and says, go ahead, basically do what you want. But it's no different than, what these Jews say, that, you should be the same on the outside, do what everyone else does, and on the inside you can do what you want, right? That is one of the claims. That we'll see a little more in depth. But the main thing here is that why should we? I mean, a similar thing. Why should we be any different? Why should we be any different than the nations, that surround us? So, if you live in the land of Israel, right? Many will claim, I live in the, if you live in the land of Israel, so why do I have to keep that much? I live in the land, right? Living in the land is a mitzvah in of itself, right? Which is a whole discussion, but they'll claim it's a mitzvah in and of itself. I don't have to, do much more. I can live, I can be a Jew and live the way I want in the Jewish homeland. So the question is, if you live in the Jewish homeland, so why should you be any different than anybody else? And the other thing is, that outside the land, so what's the status of Jews outside the land? So the Jews outside the land certainly have an obligation to keep the Torah, even though it's pretty clear from the Torah itself that the mitzvah should be kept, in the land, right? That's where it seems that the mitzvah should be kept. But there's also an obligation, you live outside the land, keep the mitzvahs as well, right? Sort of, I guess, practice till you're going to get to the land, at least certainly when the Messiah comes. But, the point is that even if you live outside the land, okay, there are certain things you can't do, right? Because it's dependent on the land. The person wants to give truma and meiser from fruits, vegetables, whatever, and taking tithes from it, that's what it means. You take tithes from it, therefore you cannot do that outside the land. It's dependent on living in the land. So one thing they'll claim is there's no place to the mitzvahs in Chutz La'aretz, outside the land of Israel, right? Because Jewish people only in their land, are able to keep the mitzvahs properly. But as my Rabbi here explains, that Moshe Rabbeinu says, and he gives over, right, the last parts of all these mitzvahs in the book of Deuteronomy, right before they enter the land. Now we know that Moshe hit the rock instead of speaking to the rock, so Moshe wasn't allowed to come into the land. But this is right before Jewish people go into the land. So he says, so my Rabbi here points out that when they're in the desert, they're separate from everybody, right? They're living their own lives. No one's around. God's taking care of them. They're totally separate. Now, what happens when they go in the land? Right? When they go in the land, there's an obligation. There's an obligation to keep the mitzvahs and to guard the Torah and establish it. Now, a few weeks back, we saw by the story of Benot Tzlafchot, the daughters of Tzlafchot. Tzlafchot died, right? How did he die? So Tzlafchot transgressed keeping the laws of Shabbos. They didn't know what to do with him. They ended up killing him in the end. But he transgressed the mitzvah for the sake of heaven. He knew he was going to be liable for the death penalty. But the whole point was that people might have thought, if you're in the desert, right, keeping Shabbos may not be so important because the obligation of keeping Shabbos is only going to be when you go in the land. So once you go in the land, that's when it's going to be established. Comes along Tzlafchot and says, people should understand, even in the desert, even if it doesn't necessarily apply, they have to keep the mitzvahs of Shabbos. They have to keep the mitzvahs of Shabbos also. So, therefore, by showing that, he was liable for the death penalty. He got killed, right? And they killed him. They didn't know exactly what to do with him at the beginning, but they end up killing him, and that's the whole story of the daughters of Tzlafchot, because they had no brothers. There was no one there to inherit. So the question was, why should they themselves lose out? So the whole story that goes on there about the laws of inheritance and the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu admitted what they said was right. If there are no sons, they should definitely inherit. That's not the topic for now. But what will people claim? Once they're in the desert, it's all practice till they get into the land of Israel. Once they get into the land of Israel, there's an obligation, to keep the Torah, to establish it, to do what God wants, right? For what God wants us to do. But if we're dispersed among the nations, and we don't live in the palace of the king, who says we're obligated to keep the Torah? Right? So they'll claim, one of their claims will be, we live outside the land. We're not in the palace of the king. So I have no obligation to keep the Torah. Therefore, Rabbi points out that the Torah was translated by 70 rabbis. They all came up with the same, with the same translation, which is pretty miraculous because they were each one was in a different room, and they were told, okay, write the Bible from the beginning, right? Write the Torah from the very beginning. They all came up with the same translation. So that means, as Rabbi points out, that not only was it a miracle that they all came up with the same translation, it goes to show that the Torah cannot be exchanged. In other words, if things changed, if they had changed anything, which any number of them, could have changed the order, could have changed the meaning, in the verse. There are a number of things that they could have changed on their own. But the miracle was that they don't. So when they look at all the translations, they're all the same, right? That is a pretty impressive thing. So Rabbi points out from that, just like the Torah there is translated, before they go into the land. So you see, the Torah doesn't change. And even though they still weren't in the land, it's still, the Torah is going to be the same. And they still have an obligation to keep it without changing it, without taking things out, etc. That the Torah is eternal. So this is a double-edged sword, in a number of ways. First thing is, there are a few claims here. One is, I live in the land, so I live in the land. What I don't know. What do I have to keep the mitzvahs for? I'm living in the land. I'm living in the palace of the king. Okay, so I'm living in the land. Why do I have to keep mitzvahs? That's one side of the argument. The other side of the argument is, if you live outside the land, maybe the Torah is only supposed to be kept in the land itself. Well, it's a contradiction. Either you tell me it has to be kept in the land, and it won't be kept outside the land, or it's kept outside the land, all the more so it's kept in the land. Right? It seems like a contradiction, where they're saying two opposite things. So there's an American expression that is, you can't have your cake and eat it, right? You can't speak out of both sides of your mouth and say two totally opposite things. Either the Torah is obligated to keep if you live in the land of Israel, even if you don't live in the land of Israel, you still have to keep it, right? It's practice till you get to the land of Israel, whenever that may be, or when the Messiah comes, either you come before or come after. Or you tell me that outside the land, okay, you don't have to keep it at all. We'll be like everybody else. Right? So, you got two basic statements that are on both sides of the spectrum, right? They're totally opposite sides, of the spectrum. So what you see, certainly in the last generation, you'll see that, Israelis live in the land. Many of them, know nothing about their heritage. Nonetheless, they live there and, feel they don't have to, to keep anything because, in fact, they do live here. So, that's sort of a double-edged sword, I guess, in a certain way, because this lack of knowledge is going to cause all kinds of problems. There was most people know I don't get so political, but I'll just mention one thing political that I think it was last week. This whole controversy with what's going on the Western Wall with the Reform movement and wanting to gain a bigger area by the Western Wall, which in and of itself is it doesn't make any sense, because one of the things they took out of their prayer book is going back to the land of Israel, and certainly they don't believe in sacrifices. They don't believe that when the temple is going to be rebuilt, if the temple, according to them, is going to be rebuilt, that will go back to animal sacrifice. So according to them, they don't believe in the holiness of the land. They don't believe in the holiness of the place. So obvious question is, what in the world they're complaining about, they want equal rights. They want to, take the chief rabbinate, sort of throw them out. They want to, they want to be recognized. They want to be recognized here, right? But, the question is, if they don't believe, in what they're setting out to do, then what are they arguing about? Because they certainly don't believe we're going to go back to animal sacrifice. They certainly don't believe, in the returning of the Jews to the land of Israel. Those are the two crucial things, that make us, Jews. So if they don't believe in that and they took that out of their prayer book, then they should have nothing to complain about. Right? It's just about power and wanting to be considered, as a legitimate movement. Right? That's one issue. Another issue is what happens, within the same context about what's going on there by the Western Wall. That the president of Israel said, you got to make a compromise. They wanted to, make more of a compromise, and the government backed off that. But he said, we have to be like Beis Hillel, right? We have to learn to be like the house of Hillel, because everybody knows, it says in Ethics of Our Fathers that any machloikis, any difference of opinion that was for the sake of heaven was a difference of opinion between the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai. Right? So we know that, or if you don't know, you'll find out that basically there's disagreement between them. Then today we hold like the house of Hillel against the house of Shammai. Normally the house of Shammai is stricter, the house of Hillel is more lenient, in different ways. So when it comes to a difference of opinion between them, in almost all cases we go to the house of Hillel against Shammai. But there, of course, there's always a but, and the but is that by the house of Hillel, you say, okay, we're arguing against Beis Shammai. They in many cases look, to be lenient. They're not lenient for the sake of being lenient. Shammai and Hillel agree on most things, right? There are plenty of things they disagree with, but it's not like the house of Hillel is coming and saying, no, you have to be lenient. We can throw these things out. We can turn the Torah into a pretzel. We can make it into whatever you want. It doesn't matter. That's not who the house of Hillel is. They're not interested in, they're just they're going to compromise for the sake of compromise. That's not what their essence is. I mean, they're holding by what the Torah says. They're, just in the case when they argue with Beis Shammai, and Beis Shammai is stricter. So in the future, when the Messiah comes, we'll go according to Beis Shammai, not according to Beis Hillel, right? But we shouldn't look at the house of Hillel as doing whatever they want, like almost comparing the house of Hillel to Reformed Jews. Okay, they were lenient over here. You have to be lenient also. You have to learn how to compromise. But obviously comparing apples and pineapples, or apples and oranges, whatever you want to call it, that doesn't make any sense, right? So what's the point? The point is that you take someone with minimal knowledge, and with minimal knowledge, it brings up a Talmudic concept, right? The Talmudic concept is, which is true when the disagreement of the house of Hillel against the house of Shammai, we hold like the house of Hillel in most cases, right? There are certain cases we go like the house of Shammai, fine. Right, but you cannot take a Talmudic dictum and then just go with it and say, well, the house of Hillel is always lenient against the house of Shammai, so we should learn to be like the house of Hillel. I don't know if you hear the irony, in that statement. So, in my language, a lot of sense it doesn't make. You cannot extrapolate logically. You cannot extrapolate and, take an idea and then go beyond what the idea meant. Because even though, Hillel and Shammai disagreed, and they disagreed on some pretty serious things, right? One of them, who's considered a mamzer. A mamzer is somebody that is not allowed to be with, a man's not allowed to be with a certain woman. They have a child. That child's called the bastard child, right? That mamzer can only marry someone of that same union, or a convert. Now that being said, they disagree. But that did not stop the children of Hillel, and the students of Hillel marrying, people that are like Beis Shammai. right? Their students married each other, right? Obviously not the men, right? But they married each other. So therefore, even if they disagreed, right, and they disagreed on some pretty serious things, nonetheless, it wasn't like they were outside the guideline of Torah. It's not like they were taking the Torah and turning it into a pretzel, and doing whatever they want. I don't like this mitzvah. Hillel's Makel, they are much more lenient. We'll throw it out. That's not what they said. Right? That's not what they said at all. So even though they disagreed, their students married each other. Right? You had the house of Shammai that, married in with the house of Hillel, and vice versa. So they agreed. The parameters in which they disagreed, you have to look at it in those terms. You cannot go outside those parameters. So when someone says you got to be like the house of Hillel and be lenient and compromise, that's not what Hillel stood for. In terms of the Beis Shammai, yeah, they were lenient, in different ways, but it doesn't mean that they pick and choose. They do what they want. It doesn't mean, they became so open-minded and they said, we're gonna allow certain things to happen when the people, when they don't even believe it they don't even believe the thing itself, right? That doesn't make any logical sense. So, I'm always fond of saying, and people can like it or they can hate it. If you're gonna argue, at least know what you're arguing about. Do not bring take things out of context. Because when you take things out of context, that's exactly what it does. You take it out of context, it makes you look kind of silly. Because you're using something that has specific terminology, that has vast ramifications, and you're taking it totally out of its context. I mean, it happens all the time, I guess. See what people do. They, you hear people speak, and people who are against different speakers, they'll splice what they say, so you won't hear anything before, anything after. You just hear that, controversial quote or whatever it is, and what that does is say, oh, look, this person's crazy, he's a fanatic, look what he just said. But you didn't hear anything before. You didn't hear anything after. They just cut it to that sound bite, and they make you listen and say, listen, look what this person said, but you don't understand what the context, is. So taking things out of context and turning things around are, certainly what the media is certainly good at. But, in spiritual terms, as my Rabbi here points out, the Torah is eternal. Torah doesn't change. Now, a person can decide to break their covenant with God. That's their choice. Right? But the Torah states clear. There's reward, there's punishment. Right? So, however God's going to judge it, right? There's going to be God, it's going to be for God to judge, but this is a 100% a Torah concept. All you have to do is read the second paragraph of the Shema. When you read the second paragraph of the Shema, it tells you that if you do what God wants, you get rain, you get food, everything's good. If not, there's payback, right? There won't be rain, won't be food. So, there is reward and punishment. In this world and the next world, there is a concept, that exists. Certainly the Rambam, Maimonides brings it down in the 13 principles, right? God is absolute, and if God is absolute and God is unique, he has to have the ability to reward and punish, however God set it up. But, in this case, which is a scary thing, you cannot speak out of both sides of your mouth where each one does not make sense when you put it in context of the other. So again, if you're in the land of Israel, the whole point is you're there because God wants you to be there and wants you to keep the mitzvahs there. So then logically I would say, okay, if he wants you to keep the mitzvahs there, then outside the land, I don't have to keep it. Right? Maybe it's just a custom, maybe it's a myth, maybe, who knows what. But outside the land, I don't have to do it. But then they'll say, outside the land, if the Torah doesn't change, then it shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter where you are. There'll just be certain things you can't do. Right? If you live outside the land. So, so what you have is an interesting thing. Rabbi points out that today the claims have changed, according to the times, according to the place of the Jewish people, because there'll be those that live in the land, and they certainly desire to serve God, right, and do what He wants, certainly in the land, but what they'll do is they'll say, listen, we wanted to build up the land, to have a land of Jews, right? Theodore Herzl, if you read his book, The Jewish State, he would have been happy if he was in Uganda or if he was in Argentina. That really, to him, didn't matter. Getting the land of Israel was like the cherry on top. Didn't want to offend anybody, but if he could get the land of Israel, he would. Otherwise he's willing to go elsewhere. But his goal, 100%, in coming back to the land and having the land, is to have a land of Jews. Right? England, the English live in England, Albanians live in Albania, Italians live in Italy, so why shouldn't the Jews have their own homeland? Not only that, but it's been the biggest miracle in the history of man that you take any other nation, you take any other nation, disperse them among the nations of the world, what happens? They disappear. Right? The 100% they disappear. Romans, they had power, for hundreds of years, they disappeared. Few artifacts left of them, but they disappeared. Greeks, no different, except, we have more things left from them. Our educational system is based on them. Waterways, other things, are based on the Greeks. The outlook of the world today, certainly in the Western world, is like the Greeks. Worship the body, gymnasium, all these other things. That the Greeks have left their influence, but the Greeks themselves, again, certainly have disappeared. So then you have people who will say, we want to live in a land, we want to live in our own homeland. Now, if we can live in the land of Israel, fine. So the fact that they got the land of Israel is a pretty big miracle, no question, certainly no question about that. But what they've done is, they said, let's go back to the land, we'll build up the land, but we're not interested in having any connection to Torah. Now, the Jewish people have been connected to Torah for 2,000 years and more, right? Certainly longer. So that connection to Torah has given the Jewish people the strength to continue and survive, because the Jews have been dispersed throughout all the nations. Certainly prophets, speak about it, but no nation has ever remained intact. From that, you look at America, and you look at all the people that came in the 20th century, and Koreans and Chinese and Scandinavians and other people that came to America, became part of this melting pot. So what happened? Their customs disappeared. Right? They themselves melted in to be American, but they, wherever they came from, their customs and whatever they did there pretty much disappeared. So you take the Jewish people, no land, don't have their own language, nothing, being dispersed amongst all the nations. It's pretty darn miraculous that they survived. If you look at, Jewish history, you see that by Nobel Prizes, for instance, Jews are at the top. They're 1/1000 of the world's population. Probably even less than that now. But if you look at how many Nobel Prizes they've won, it's unbelievable, because within the soul there's this desire for knowledge. And parents, instead of giving their kids Torah in the last generation, when they came to America, etc., what do they give them? They wanted them to have a better life than they did. They suffered tremendously in Europe. So they wanted their kids to have, a much better fighting chance. So it gave a little bit of Judaism. But the main thing was, do well in school, go to a good college, get a good job, make a lot of money. That's the American dream. So, many Jews were successful with that. And what happened? Judaism went out the window, right? Totally disappeared. Because when they came to America, they threw their tefillin overboard. They weren't interested. Being part of an old system, old European system. They weren't interested. And certainly, in the land of Israel itself, during the war, they had the opportunity to ransom, thousands of Jews, save them in Europe, and they weren't interested. They wanted young people that were going to build up the country. They were not interested in going back, to all these antiquated laws that, to them didn't make any sense. They didn't want any part of it. They wanted to build a new Jewish people. So, so that being said, so the whole generation of Jews has disappeared. I mean, disappearing like flies. But the irony is that even these Zionists wanted to live in the land, are very strong about living in the land, right? The first thing they did was that they weren't interested in keeping Torah, weren't interested in keeping mitzvahs, and the worst part is that they cause other people to go astray. Now, this is a major point, because it's one thing, you want to be an atheist, you want to be a socialist, you want to be a communist, whatever it is, and you're going to pass it on to your family. That's one thing. That's one thing. But the fact you want to go out and make a cause, and you want to get other people and you want to trip them up and get them to believe in your cause, okay, that's something else. So Talmud says someone who's machti as a rabbi, right? Someone who causes other people to go astray. What's the punishment? Punishment is they lose the portion of the world to come, right? That is a very serious thing. So you have to ask the fundamental question. One thing, you want to believe in certain things. Well, why in the world are you going to go out and bring, schlep other people, into these beliefs, right? So someone will say, wow, don't the Orthodox think the same thing? Don't the Orthodox want everyone to be Orthodox? Well, everyone was Orthodox up until 200 years ago. Or a little more, maybe like 250 years ago. Then you had these splinter movements that, took things out of the Torah, turned it into a pretzel, etc., which has been an absolute disaster. 70-80% intermarriage. Totally, an utter disaster. Because, the conservative movement was interested in bringing the Jewish people into the 20th century. Being more modern, whatever, but, we know what the end result with that is. But the irony, which I think is tremendously ironic, is, again, you want to do what you want to do, fine, but why do you have to bring down, other people, certainly when the thing doesn't work? So yeah, we definitely believe, the Orthodox, we definitely believe 100% that, we're right, and that the Torah is true, and, we'll do what we can to help, others see that, but, keep in mind, up until 250 years ago, everybody was like us. So now, people have been so estranged, from Judaism, and intermarriage is so rampant, and there's so much, lack of knowledge. So they look at what Torah, true Judaism is, it's like, it doesn't make any sense. It's, why would anyone choose that? Why would anyone dress that way? They look strange, they sound strange, sounds like a cult, etc., which most people don't know what a cult is. It's the furthest thing from a cult, by far, because anyone who's ever walked into to an Orthodox yeshiva and to see people arguing over the text, they're not being stayed up, they're not staying up late at night, and not being given any sleep or any food or, whatever, and trying to be brainwashed. I mean, they're trying to figure out what these texts say and what the truth is, but they're within a certain level of parameters, for sure. So, that being the case, it's not a cult, it's not being brainwashed. Anyone can, choose to walk out anytime. They have no obligation to stay. Everybody's got free will. And at the end of the day, 95 to 97% of the time it works. When you look at marriage, for instance, among the Orthodox, even if you say it's 10% that there's a divorce rate, which I think is still high, even if you say it's 10%, the secular world is 6 times higher, if not more. If you live together, 7 times higher. So people say, oh, you can't get divorced, and look at the way the Orthodox look at it, and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, we're not interested in divorce. But divorce exists. God allows people to get divorced. The thing is that a person's married, a person has difficult times, you have to work on it. If it cannot be salvaged, you worked at it, you tried, it can't be salvaged, that's it, then you have to get divorced. It's not what God necessarily wants, but, people do get divorced. It's not like, oh, you can't, you're stuck, etc. You're not stuck. I mean, the man has to be the one to give the bill of divorce. Yeah, he can extort his, he can store his wife and their family before he gives the bill of divorce. That's a whole discussion. Right? That's a whole discussion. Sometimes system can get abused. I get it. There is such a thing. At the same time, that's not the deterrent over here. Right? That's not the vast majority of people aren't getting divorced because, these recalcitrant husbands won't give a bill of divorce. That's not even on the agenda over here. Not even close. Even if you have people like that, it's, the very small percentage. Divorce is ugly in most cases. But even so, that has nothing to do with anything here. If you look at in the secular world, there's a 6 times divorce rate. How many excuses are you going to make in order to say the system doesn't work? And maybe the Orthodox have it right. Say, people get married too young, they don't have degrees, they don't have this, so why don't they end up in divorce? You know why? Because most people, when they get married, have the same goals. Doesn't always end up that way, but they have the same goals. They have the same desires. They're going in the same direction. It's not about hooking up when people have drunk, if they had too much to drink, or other things that go on in the secular world. Attraction is important. Physicality is important, but it's not, the only thing. Because a husband can't be with his wife during certain times. In that case, it doesn't matter. Because a person has to have a connection. A person has to have a connection to his wife outside the physicality. Because once a person gets older, the physicality is not the same. So that's the reason, you have, marital purity laws for exactly that reason. So with those factors involved, it's no wonder that the system works, because you have a lot more in common. Right? And it's just like a plant. If you don't water the plant dies. Right? A marriage too. Even if you're going in the same direction, you have to work at it. People get into bad habits, get into a rut, different things. You have to work at it. That there's no, that there's no question. But we have to remember over here that, what goes on in Israel, secular Israelis, don't want to hear about their roads being closed, for the Sabbath. They want to be able to do what they want. They don't want to have religious coercion, and all that. But if you didn't have status quo where things were closed on Shabbos, so yeah, Israel would be like any other nation. It would look like any other nation. Just go to Tel Aviv. You have some enclaves there of Orthodox Jews, but you go to Tel Aviv, it's a secular city. Go to Haifa, it's a secular city. Go to all these places, it's a secular city. Come to Jerusalem, come to Bnei Brak, other places, totally different. Right? Like a ghetto, right? In many ways. So that's a good thing, because that's the way Judaism is going to perpetuate itself. That's the way it's going to continue. That's the way it's going to survive. But that's why you have this fight. Because we have the most holiness, you have the most impurity as well. And that is, that they'll fight tooth and nail right before the Messiah comes. Because their whole goal is to uproot the Torah. Right? That is what they want. When they came to the land of Israel, that was their goal. So, yeah, we want to live in the palace of the king, so to speak, but we don't have any obligation. Well, Tzlofchad already said, and already showed, that even though they didn't live in the palace of the king, look how severe the punishment is if you don't do what God wants. That's what he showed. So, as my Rabbi points out, and, this is a mistake, certainly in this generation and previous generations as well, is that the Torah doesn't change. If the Torah changed, well, we know what it looks like. We know that thousands and millions will disappear because, the more innovation, the more change, the more of a disaster it has been. If you want to tell me that doing all these things would bring more people to the synagogue, etc., would bring more people back to tradition. We can have a discussion, probably a small discussion, but we can have a discussion. But that is not, that is definitely not the case. So the point over here, as my Rabbi here points out, that, we are distinct from all the other nations. We're supposed to be distinct. That's what makes us God's chosen people. We chose God, God chose us. But the whole purpose of being chosen doesn't mean better. Being chosen means I have more obligation. When I have more obligation, it means I have to live to a higher standard. So when we're out there in the world, whatever we're doing, and we do things that, a secular person or a non-Jew say, oh, look at these Jews, look how bad, look what they do, they cut in line, they cheat, they this, they that. It's a desecration of God's name. It makes us look bad. We are the ones holding the banner. We're the ones holding the flag. In order to show what the Torah is, and certainly what it represents, but at the same time, we cannot go outside its boundaries. So there are groups out there. You got Reform, Conservative, you got some modern Orthodox, Open Orthodox, or whatever you want to call it. They're breaking the boundaries. And by breaking the boundaries, they break down the whole system of what is holy. And the end result will be disaster. Because the further you go away from tradition, the more you want to make innovations, you'll justify it, you'll justify it in any way. Right? On the one hand, you'll say, if you live in the land, you don't have to keep the Torah. If you don't live in the land, you don't have to keep the Torah. Some say you do, some say you don't. Maybe it'll change. Maybe, we'll all eat the same hallucinogenic mushroom. We'll all go the same route. Some will go this way, some will go that way. But we'll change things as we see fit. Now that is a problem. It's a problem very simply because you cannot just change things. You can't just say, you got to change with the times. So we stated here clear that Torah doesn't change. It cannot change if it's eternal. Right? We mentioned before, when it came to electricity, the last generation, so the rabbis, the last generation, had to decide, is electricity forbidden on Shabbos? Because is that like kindling a fire or not? So the rabbis didn't know. They never came in contact with electricity. So the rabbis, the last generation, had to decide, right? Is it like kindling a fire? Is it not like kindling a fire? So there's disagreement exactly what it was, but everyone agreed it was forbidden. So then people will say, oh, look, they're changing the Torah. Changing the Torah means I put an extra tzitzis on my talis, or on my tzitzis that I wear under my shirt. Changing it means, or adding to the Torah means I add an extra parchment in tefillin, or phylacteries, or whatever phylacteries are. Therefore, that is what change is. That's adding things. Trying to see if something fits in within the category, that's trying to understand. Is it permissible? Is it forbidden? That's not adding an extra mitzvah. That's not the 614th mitzvah over here. Right? It's finding out, does it fit in or not? And that's not what we're doing, because there were many things. Certainly, as technology changes, there are many things the rabbis didn't know about. It was discovered much later. Because it was discovered much later, there's a whole question. Where does it fit in? That's the question. That's adding on to the Torah? That's explaining. That's interpreting, people will say. That's interpreting what the Torah says. You're absolutely right. Got any other better way to figure it out? We don't have any precedent. Right? Electricity, if they didn't know what it was. So how can you tell me it is a fire? It's not a fire. How do you know? Right? So you need great rabbis in every generation to be able to determine things. That's not changing. right? We mentioned this many times. That is not changing. That is not changing in the essence, of the Torah. So therefore, if you add, you're really subtracting. I mean, one story I always tell is in the 70s when there's Soviet Jews weren't allowed to leave the Soviet Union. So in the conservative movement, they printed these Haggadahs for Passover. And they had a fourth matzah. What was the fourth matzah? The fourth matzah was for the sake of remembering Soviet Jews. Right? It's bread of affliction. We're thinking of their affliction, not being allowed out of the Soviet Union, or the former Soviet Union. So what happened? That didn't even last a generation. Most people, we'd ask them today, the conservative movement, they didn't even know such a thing existed. But that's what they did. So, we can't add or subtract. That's pretty obvious. But you also can't change the meaning of things the way you want to see it. Right? That's also not fair. Right? If you look at the Torah, either the Torah is true or it's not true. Did God give the Torah to Moshe and pass it down? Did Moshe make it up? Was there a committee? Were there four authors and a redactor? Right? What happened? So I would say, black and white, you believe God gave the Torah to the Jewish people? You got to keep it. Pass it down to Moshe. It doesn't change. 13 principles of faith. You got to keep it. If you don't believe it, if you don't believe it's true, then why keep anything? Right? It doesn't make any sense. Either you keep it, or you don't keep it. If you tell me I'm growing, I'm going to take time and this and that's one thing. Right? But if you make it, as I'll call it, a travesty of a mockery of a sham, then that's going to be the end result. That's what it is. You're going to have people quoting all kinds of things they don't know anything about. So, if a person has a question, and they're not sure, so why don't they look into it? Why don't they delve into it? Go to people who have the answers. Because they don't want an answer. They don't want to be told, oh, that's the answer. Now I'm obligated to keep things. They don't want that. No one's interested in that. People say, oh, they're open-minded, right? Till their brains fall on the floor. They're totally open-minded, but everyone's wrong except them. That's not being open-minded. That's being stupid. Right? So if you look into something and you're seriously open-minded, and you want to look in to see if it's true or not, that's one thing. Most people today are totally apathetic. They don't care if it's true or not. They're not interested. They're totally apathetic. It's like trying to start a Jeep with a 9-volt. You're not even going to get off the ground because it's not even a question they're dealing with. And that's the scary part. That is the scary part, because then even if you don't care, say, fine, I'll take make-believe. Right, which I've heard people say that, you go to the synagogue, you hear the rabbi speak, and he gives this whole great sermon, and it's like an acting job, it's like Hollywood. That's what being in a synagogue is about. It's about Hollywood, it's about acting, it's about make-believe. Yeah, I want make-believe. A majority of American Jews want make-believe. Okay. But that's all it is. Because if you think about it deep down, you're just being thrown a bag of bones. That's it. It's not real. Someone told me also, the more, you have to pay money, get a ticket to come to the High Holy Day services for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. So someone said the more money you pay, the closer you get to the air conditioner. So I said, I got a great idea. Buy a portable one, bow down to it. Like, wow. You're so cynical. I said, I know, but didn't you just say, the more money I pay, the closer I get to the air conditioning? So blessed are you, king of the air conditioners. I mean, doesn't that make sense? Okay, we're making a little bit of fun here. But what are we doing? Right? I shouldn't say we. What are these people doing? The answer is they don't care. It doesn't register. They'll say, I can't be Orthodox. I'm not interested in being Orthodox, so I'll take fantasy. Fantasy has destroyed the Jewish people, will continue to destroy the Jewish people. The only thing you can fight against fantasy, right, is delving into Torah, keeping the mitzvahs, and doing what God wants you to do. I just want to remind people, I have a course that I set up. It's called Discover Your Biblical Path, 6 modules. Anyone coming out of Christianity or idolatry wants to know what it means to be a Jew or to be a Noahide. You can find out about what it means to be a Jew, about oral tradition, about some of the holidays. You can find out what it means to be a Noahide, how to find a rabbi, how to find a community, how to deal with family, family issues. And then you can make a choice which way you want to go. If you want to be a convert, you want to stay a Noahide. There are also 7 interviews that I interviewed people that were interested in conversion and converted. Some still in the process, and still others who didn't convert and were Noahides. You can find that on my Facebook fan page, Beyond Orthodox Conversion to Judaism, or Beyond Noahides. I also have a blog, orthodoxconversion.com. So as I mentioned, I give classes to converts and to Noahides. I also have an Intro to Kabbalah class every Tuesday, 9 o'clock. We're in the 4th section of the book Derech Hashem, The Way of God, which we're speaking now about prayer and Talis and Tefillin. We're going to speak about other aspects of prayer as well. I have 2 question and answer sessions that meet twice a week. One on Tuesday, 10 a.m. New York time. One on Thursday, 2 p.m. New York time. And anyone who wants to contact me can contact me at rabbichaimkoffman@gmail.com. RABBICHAIMCOFFMAN @gmail.com. Wishing everyone a great Shabbos.